More and more people are staying in the sport of triathlon for far longer, into their 50s, 60s and beyond. For some, it's to have fun, perhaps for the health benefits, whilst for others, it's that competitive element, to race, to rip it up. But let's be honest here, things can get harder as you get older, and that's what I want to discuss here today. So I've brought in 4 very inspiring characters who love to do a bit of triathlon. We've got Diane, Nick, my dad, Phil, and Steve, who many of you will have met here on GTN before. I'm going to be discussing with them how they manage to get the most out of themselves, what's the secret, and with the help of Training Peaks, we're going to be looking at how you can continue to swim, bike and run through the ages.
Hey, I'm Diane Hire. I'm 61 years old. I've been doing triathlons for 20 years.
My name's Nick and I'm 49, nearly 50 in November.
I'm Steve. I'm 50 years of age.
My name's Phil, I'm Mark's dad. I'm 64 years old, be 65 this year.
So I used to run a lot, and then to cross-train, I started going out on the bike and I enjoyed swimming, which then led me to enter a race, triathlon, which I thoroughly enjoyed.
I got into triathlon by mistake when my wife wasn't very well. She wasn't well enough for the Trowbridge Triathlon, so she said, you can do it. And so I went along and it was really hard.
I got into triathlon about 15 years ago. I started running when Mark and his siblings were all off all over the country swimming or doing whatever sports they were, and I felt I needed to get fit again.
I got into triathlon probably about 5 years ago. It was actually a bet. Why do I do it? I've asked myself that a few times. It makes me feel good, makes me feel sporty, because I'm not really sporty, and I like the feeling I get after a race.
Well, these 4 are just all so impressive, all in their own way. Of course, I am biased, but my dad amazes me every day, considering he came into the sport relatively late on and now just loves to do things like a half marathon every weekend without fail. Just is so impressive. Then we've got Diane, who seems to be at every local running event I go to, and quite often first female overall, if not being competitive overall. And then we've got Nick and Steve, who, let's be honest, really aren't that old, but Nick loves an epic. In fact, he did Marathon des Sables last year, which is, well, hats off to him for that. And then we've got Steve, who just seems to be taking his Ironman training in his stride. But they're far from alone. In fact, the average age was 42.8 years old at the Ironman World Championships in 2015, based on a study conducted that year. Average age. The oldest female to ever compete in the Ironman World Championships is 78 years old. The oldest male, 85, and in fact, he's planning to do it also at 90 years old too. Absolutely mind-blowing. But that is the amazing thing about the triathlon community. It's incredibly accepting of all abilities and all ages. It's so supportive. And triathlon can have a huge positive impact on a person's lifestyle and health. And despite all this talk of racing so far, there is actually no requirement to race to be a triathlete. You can be a triathlete that simply loves to swim, cycle, or run. And you can actually choose which sports you do should a niggle prevent you from doing one. So there are still options. Talking of which, should you change your training as you age? Let's discuss that one. Right, firstly guys, I want your expert opinion on training as you get older. Has it changed for yourselves? Should it change? Don't all jump at once.
Well, I've had to accept I'm a bit slower than I was.
Yeah?
That goes
Especially
for me
with my
too.
running. With my running, yeah.
Yeah, although, and speed, I suppose. The amount of speed, put it in, and intensity. And impact, actually. So running, I've backed off running quite a lot during the winter, and then I'll pick it up about now.
So that kind of like that builds, you need to take more seriously and kind of get the foundations there.
Yeah.
You know, I don't race as often now because the recovery is, it does take longer to recover from, especially if it's a tough race, like say I've just done the marathon. So for a couple of weeks, you really need to make sure you're recovered from that properly.
Yeah, the same. I mean, I found that the trust I would have had in a training program, I kind of adapt it now to how I feel. So I don't feel rigid on that. If I'm not feeling right, I have a bit more pragmatic view of the program and think, well, just a day isn't you know, I'm in it for the long haul, so a couple of days here or there won't matter. So yeah, just listening, yeah, as these guys have said, just listening to sort of what's going on.
Are there any other considerations you have now, I'm thinking more body here, that you wouldn't have had sort of 20 years ago? That you, yeah?
Yeah, loads. I mean,
Yeah.
Knees, Achilles, shoulder. Yeah.
And is there anything you do about that, that things you found have worked, have helped?
Regular physio. I'm in the physio every 2-3 weeks, I'd say.
Yeah.
We were talking about S&C as
Yeah, I do regularly S&C sessions without a dodgy knee.
Yeah, I remember, so yeah, you had a really bad knee. You
Yeah,
sort
so
of
I
had to
couldn't
stop
run
for 9 months.
9 months, yeah. But now I can run without a brace or anything on, and that's just through doing lots of strength and conditioning. Physio first and then strength and conditioning, and I keep it up every week.
I think
Yes.
that's where it's good, like as being a triathlete, you can, you know, if you sort of like need to have some time off from running because you're injured, then, you know, you get on the turbo or you can go swimming and concentrate on the other discipline for, you know,
And in
for
fact,
a
the
while.
swimming, the swimming was a good indication that it was getting better, because when I was doing the turns, I could feel it, and then towards the end of the period, I thought, well, it's not hurting so much now, you know, and I'll go and try a run again. Maybe not quite yet, but
And do you, out of interest, do you tend to train alone or with a group? Because I guess the worry is by training with a group is you end up training with a lot of younger people who are then pushing you beyond maybe where you're comfortable. Or how do you play it? What's the...
Yeah, I tend to train with people who are generally younger than me, which is good from the pushing point of view, but I'm definitely cashing checks in my head that my body can't quite keep up with. You know, I can't. In my head, I'm still in my 20s, and yes, I can keep up with them. But reality is, no, I can't.
Have you got any advice you would give to someone that either is a current triathlete, maybe going into the older years, or is getting into triathlon, that either from your own learnings or maybe even from your own errors that you would pass on?
I think your family or whoever you're with is like a massive part of it, because although you can manage, I can manage myself, so I can, if I don't get enough sleep, that's my fault, and if I don't eat correctly, that's also my fault. But the unknown is like massive, is also a huge part of my life, and like, you know, kids and wife and, you know, non-triathletes who are watching me do this. If that's not right, then nothing's right. So that's a huge part, I'd say, and sort of getting sort of buy-in early, because I've selfishly gone after something and halfway through thinking, yeah, this is like really selfish, and get that massive training guilt. But this time has been a bit different, although a bit slower, a bit older, but it's a bit more healthy in terms of doing it every day.
Well, it's been great to hear from the athletes, but now I'm keen to hear from someone that regularly coaches athletes, including masters, older athletes. So we're off to meet with Phil Mosley, who is founder and coach for My Pro Coach, who, well, if you've ever been onto Training Peaks before, you would definitely have come across his plans on there before. Now, he works closely with Training Peaks to develop his plans, and I'm keen to hear how he adapts them for the older athletes. Well, thanks, Phil, for joining us here today. Now, I'm obviously here to talk to you as a coach, but you're actually a pretty handy athlete yourself at 47 years old. So you may be able to answer some of this from a personal perspective as well. I'm not saying you're old by any means. But first off, is there anything kind of physiologically or even from a performance perspective that changes as you age?
Yeah, there are a few things, unfortunately. And the first one is that your strength reduces, or your muscle mass reduces over time, and that actually starts from when you're around 35, so relatively young, and that's a very slow gradual decrease over time. Your VO2 max also changes. Even if you maintain training, your VO2 max starts to reduce from around, can be late 20s into your 30s from that point forwards. Your maximal sprint speed reduces, and research shows that people's body fat increases over time as well. And that's more on a general population, so I don't know if that's among athletes or not, but that is the general trend. So they're all things that are kind of taking you in the wrong direction when it comes to performance.
Okay, so with that in mind then, when it comes to setting and creating a training plan yourself, what do you change or adapt differently for an older athlete versus a younger athlete's training plan?
I mean, in some ways there are a lot of similarities, a lot of things stay the same. So sometimes as people get older, they tend to do fewer high intensity interval sessions, but actually you want to keep those in because you're trying to stop people's VO2 max from declining too quickly. And research does show that athletes who don't do much high intensity work, their VO2 drops off a lot quicker than people who maintain it. So perhaps doing 1 or 2 rep sessions, interval sessions a week, and keeping that in your program. As far as strength goes, it's important for older athletes to keep doing strength work. So 2, maybe 3 sessions a week of strength work, and you'd want that to be higher resistance and fewer reps kind of strength work to really build your strength, and that's something that you'd need to progress towards rather than just jumping straight into that. The other thing I find is that people don't recover quite as quickly as they get older. So if you have a lot of time out because you've got injured or you've been ill or for any other reason, it takes you longer to get your fitness back than when you're younger. So I mean, that's something I find myself now. Whenever I have time out, it takes me ages to get fit again, whereas when I was in my 20s, it seemed like I could have 3 or 4 weeks off and almost be exactly as good as I was at the beginning of that period.
So talking about the recovery, because I think that bit's really interesting, and I've heard this from some other athletes. I think when you're in your 20s, you can really go full speed and gain fitness quite quickly, whereas what I'm hearing from older athletes is you're focusing a lot more on that consistency and also the recovery with that, as you mentioned.
Consistency is the biggest goal when you're an older athlete, and because it takes you so long to recover from time out, you need to make sure that you avoid having that time out if you can. So you're avoiding injuries and you're avoiding burnout as well. So I've learned that I have to be really careful with how I progress my training, and so I follow a plan all the time because that keeps me on track and stops me doing stupid things. And the minute I get carried away and think I'm bomb-proof and start going off plan and thinking, oh, I'm going to go for this 2-hour run with this guy or whatever, I just get injured straight away, and then it's months before I can get fit again. So, you know, I keep making the same mistakes, but that's what you need to do, and that's what I need to do.
And is there anything you can track and prevent you from making those mistakes and keep it on track and consistent?
Yeah, I mean, tracking wise, I think you need to track your hours that you're training and also your training stress. So training stress is a kind of a combination of your training duration and how hard you're training, and it's a kind of a figure that is on apps like Training Peaks that you can use. And the idea is to keep that pretty consistent, and if you build it up, it has to build up really slowly. So you've got daily training stress and you've got a weekly training stress, and you need to keep an eye on those, because as soon as they start looking like that on a graph, you're going to get yourself in trouble basically. So you just have to be super cautious with those.
Okay, and then coming to racing then, would a slightly older athlete tailor their racing a little more differently than a younger athlete, more or less races and so on?
Research shows that athletes or veteran athletes or masters athletes who race and keep racing actually lose their VO2 at a slower rate than athletes who don't race. And that's partly because they're doing higher intensity stuff, and that's how you keep your VO2 max high. But the other side of the coin is that racing is obviously quite stressful, and if you do it a lot, it takes time to recover, and if you're not recovering enough between races, you're probably going to get injured at some point or get burnout or end up having some time off, which is then going to mean that you lose fitness quicker. So there's a kind of a delicate balance to be had. I normally recommend that the older you are, you kind of race a bit less often than someone in their 20s, for example.
Okay, and final question, this is quite an important one. Can you still PB as you age?
I mean, it depends how good your PBs were in the first place, obviously. I think you can PB, as particularly your swimming and cycling can keep improving. I find that running is the thing that people struggle to keep improving as they get older, because they tend to get injured more or their mobility reduces over time. But if you're consistent and you can keep training at all three, there's no reason why you have to stop setting PBs. I mean, obviously there's going to come a point where you can't, and at 60 there seems to be a bigger drop off in VO2 max, unfortunately. But I think if you're really careful about your training and you train really well, there's no reason why you can't continue to perform at a high level.
Well, that was really interesting, but another topic that a couple of our inspiring athletes in today's video brought up was around their hearts and their heart rates, whether they should be pushing their heart rates to their maximum. Now, it's definitely obviously a topic that I want to discuss further and look into. So for that, I thought I'd bring a specialist in the area, a sports cardiologist. So welcome, Dan Augustine. Thanks so much for joining us today. So straight into it, what happens to our hearts as we age and our heart rates with that?
Great question, Mark. So generally speaking, for adults, as we get older, our resting heart rate doesn't vary too much. So it's usually between 60 and 100 beats per minute. As we get older, our heart volume, our heart size usually gets a bit smaller, and our heart wall, the muscle, can become slightly thicker. Having said that, with endurance athletes, they have a slightly different physiology. So if you've been undertaking recreational competitive endurance sports for a number of months and years, say more than 3 to 4 hours a week over months and years, then the heart starts to adapt. And the reason it adapts is as we're exercising, particularly doing endurance sports, the vital organs and the skeletal muscle needs more blood. So the heart starts to beat a bit more quickly initially to pump more blood out. As more blood's going out to the vital organs, then more blood must be returning back to the heart, and that's called the preload. And what you find with endurance athletes is that chronically increasing preload as we're exercising causes the heart to get bigger as we exercise. And so if you look at older endurance athletes, you'll find that their heart size is probably larger than age-matched sedentary individuals. And because the heart is bigger, then actually it doesn't have to pump as quickly to allow the same cardiac output and the same amount of blood to leave the heart. And so what you'll find over time is that endurance athletes' heart rates lower. And so age-matched endurance athletes compared to those who don't exercise will probably have lower heart rates due to the physiological changes that occur.
Okay, so I think we also do in our sport get a lot of athletes coming to the sport later on, midlife crisis, let's put it out there, and they may not have done endurance sport before. So is there any risk for them, or what may they experience with their hearts as they come into the sport?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think for anyone undertaking sport, irrelevant of your age, is to just be aware of your own personal background in terms of exercise, so where you're coming from. Have you been training for a number of years, or are you just starting out? And then particularly in middle-aged and older athletes, have an idea of your own personal risk factor. So as we all get older, our cardiovascular risk increases. And so what you'll find is that sudden cardiac death during exercise usually happens in middle-aged and older individuals, the majority, and the majority of that is due to heart attacks. So it's really important to have an idea of your own cardiovascular risk. And what I mean by that is have an idea of what your blood pressure is. Do you have high blood pressure? What's your cholesterol? What's your risk of diabetes? Have you had a history of smoking in the past? Is there a family history of heart attacks at a younger age? And so once you have that risk phenotype on board and you know what your own risk is, then actually you'll be better placed to judge how hard you should go at something and what volume you should be taking, perhaps with the advice of a specialist.
Okay, and maybe just to backtrack a little bit here, is it okay for an older athlete to be doing endurance sports?
Yeah, so the take-home message here is that doing sports and exercising and being active, by far the benefits outweigh the risks. So that's the benefits in terms of bone health, the benefits in terms of modulating your cardiac risks, such as better blood pressure control, better cholesterol control, better diabetes, better psychological aspect of exercise itself. So the overall whelming take-home message is that the benefits of exercise when you're older, doing triathlons for instance, or endurance sports, outweigh the risk. But the key thing here is to have an individualised approach.
And another question that has actually been posed to me by some of the athletes who found today's video that, I mean, naively I hadn't really considered myself, but their worry is that they maybe shouldn't push their bodies or their heart rates to what they deem they could potentially go to their maximum. And one in particular in his 50s still can get his heart rate to mid 180s, which is phenomenal, very impressive. Should they? Or should they actually be holding back and being cautious at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one that I don't have a definitive answer to. And I don't think anyone can answer that definitively. So I think there are two broad topics here. The first is what does the heart rate do as we get older with exercise? And so generally speaking, our peak heart rates with exercise should fall. Historically, there's this formula, 220 take away your age, which was postulated first in the 1970s, but actually the data regarding that is relatively limited. And some may feel that it probably underestimates what your peak heart rate should be if you're older, and it probably overestimates what your peak heart rate should be if you're younger. So it actually needs to be quite a tailored individual approach. And so what I would say is, again, going back to your risk, have a look at your own personal risk. You know, the NHS is great in terms of offering well health checks after the age of 40, where you can get your blood pressure done, your cholesterol and a diabetes risk. And then if your risk is higher, take a more tailored approach depending on that in terms of heart rate. Generally speaking, I think if you're low risk with low risk factors, then actually pushing yourself, you're generally going to be fine.
Okay, and then finally then, for these athletes, is there anything they can do in day-to-day training to monitor these things and make sure that they aren't, I don't know, overexerting themselves, or making sure that they're staying safe and healthy?
Yeah, great question again. So I think if there's any significant change in your baseline and how you're used to feeling, then that's important. Whether that's a different change in terms of your stats or a difference in change in terms of symptoms. So in terms of symptoms, things that we should be looking out for are things like undue breathlessness, where you could have done that swim or that run or that cycle and actually it's becoming progressively harder and you can't work out why. Things like chest pain on exertion. Things like palpitations, particularly on exertion, or the sensation, if you have palpitations, of altered consciousness. They're all sort of flags that you should seek medical advice. I think looking at stats, if you're finding actually all of a sudden there's a jump in your heart rate compared to the level of activity that you're doing and that wasn't there before, things like that that are different to the normal trends probably should flag up that you need to probably consult someone.
Okay, super. Well, thanks so much today. Absolutely fascinating. And yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, this is, of course, a very important topic, and to be honest, I could have spent hours chatting to Dan and picking his brain on this. So if you would like to find out more about sports cardiology, or perhaps look at the potential of having a heart screening yourself, then I would thoroughly recommend checking out Dan's website, screenmyheart.co.uk. And actually similar services will be available worldwide, but still Dan has said that he's very happy to chat to anyone regardless of their location and help where possible. And personally, older or masters athletes are incredibly inspirational, a huge motivation. They kind of show us what's possible for our future in the sport. So if you are an older athlete watching this, then please do keep doing what you are doing. Thank you once again to everyone that has been involved in today's video and made it happen. I hope you have found it as interesting as I did making it. If you have enjoyed it, then please do give it a thumbs up, give it a like, and if you're not already subscribed to the channel, then please do so to support us in making future videos like this one.